You know, for all its glories, there was always something lacking about China's first overseas colonization of Africa. And so here's an alternate timeline where China colonized the West instead. Around the year 1420 CE, the largest and most powerful navy the world had ever seen sailed the seas. And other riches, the emperor ordered that future fleets should bring as much back as possible. But while China would continue sending these massive fleets for the next few decades, their furthest reach would only make it to modern-day India, Tanzania, and the East African island of Kilwa. They never quite made it to the Americas. Others would become farmers, growing rice, wheat, and cotton. And some would remain hunters and gatherers. The Chinese were not known for being particularly warlike, but rather for their massive building projects and creation of incredibly detailed works of art. They would bring their knowledge of mathematics and advanced technologies such as paper making, improved metallurgy, and gunpowder weaponry. In this scenario, the Chinese and Spanish would coexist in California for many years, trading with each other and occasionally going to war. But if the Ming had held on to their colonies, then they would have effectively created a buffer state between the Spanish and the rest of the Americas. This would prevent the Spanish from expanding too quickly and could result in a much slower conquest of the continent. The Chinese also had access to gunpowder weaponry, which would give them an advantage over the Spanish and other European powers. This would lead to a massive cultural and linguistic influence throughout the continent. While the eastern United States would become more European, culturally speaking, the West would remain more Chinese. This would lead to tensions and conflicts between the two sides, which would eventually culminate in a civil war. The United States would be a major world power. Canada and Mexico would be independent countries. South America would be dominated by Brazil and Argentina. There would be no Chinese immigrants in the U.S. or Canada, and there would be very few Americans in China. Thanks again to all of my supporters for your continued support. The Chinese would likely win this war, leading to a permanent split in the United States. Perhaps China would be the dominant global power instead of the United States. Perhaps the Chinese and Spanish would be allies instead of enemies. Perhaps the native peoples of the Americas would have been able to resist the Europeans altogether. One thing is for sure, though, the world would be a much more interesting place. The Chinese would rule over the West, while the Europeans would rule over the East. The Chinese would bring their unique architecture, art, and literature to the Americas, creating a new cultural movement. Well, for starters, everyone would be speaking Mandarin instead of English. There would be Buddhist temples and Confucian schools all over the place. The cities would be filled with skyscrapers and bullet trains. The countryside would be covered in rice paddies and factories. The standard of living would be very high because everyone would be working together towards the glory of the Chinese nation. With the introduction of these new technologies, the Americas would develop much faster than they did in our own timeline. In fact, they could become fully industrialized centuries before Europe and eventually overtake the Europeans in terms of global power. Alternatively, it could allow the Chinese to conquer California on behalf of the Spanish and gain additional land in the process. Eventually, though, the Spanish would become aware of the Chinese presence in their colony and would demand that they leave. Again, this would lead to war unless the Chinese chose to flee back to China. These new technologies would spread through the Americas like wildfire, completely changing the continent forever. Commanding it was a eunuch admiral named Zheng He. His fleet consisted of over 18,000 men total across 62 treasure ships and thousands more auxiliary vessels. Many Chinese would convert to Christianity, while many natives would convert to Buddhism or Confucianism. There's also the possibility that some Chinese immigrants would intermarry with local natives, creating a new mixed-race population. Overall, this would create a much more diverse and interesting cultural landscape in California. As soon as the Chinese learned of the riches in the Americas, they would begin importing enormous amounts of silver, gold, and other precious metals back to China. When Spain began colonizing the Americas around 1500, they would quickly come into conflict with the Chinese. There are two ways that this could go. Either the Spanish would fight the Ming colonists and attempt to push them back into the ocean, or they would simply coexist with them. If the Spanish chose the former option, then it would be a very costly war for both sides. Although the Ming Dynasty had been known for its incredible military prowess, the Spanish also had access to superior firearms technology. On the other hand, the Chinese were far more numerous and were used to fighting with large armies. If the Chinese won, then the Spanish would be pushed out of California and possibly even further west. If the Spanish won, however, then the Ming colonies would be destroyed and the Chinese presence in the Americas would disappear. This, in turn, would bolster the Chinese economy and power significantly. At the same time, the Chinese trade hubs along the Pacific coast would become melting pots of culture, mixing Chinese customs with those of the indigenous peoples. Local languages would incorporate many Chinese loanwords, especially names for new foods and objects. It is likely that a Chinese-speaking populace would exist in large numbers in California and possibly even farther north along the coast. Their mission was simple: explore the world and take whatever they wanted from it. In fact, the only thing more impressive than the size of the fleet itself was the amount of riches that it carried. Welcome to my channel. Today we are asking, what if a Chinese fleet had colonized California in the 1400s? When word got back to the Chinese emperor that the western oceans were full of gold, ivory, but what if they did? The largest city in the region at the time was probably in the general vicinity of modern-day San Francisco. You see, Zheng He's fleets brought back people from Asia as well as goods. In particular, the Chinese emperors had recently decided to institute a system of overseas colonies, similar to the way that China had expanded inland. Many of the people sent out would be farmers and settlers who would grow rice along the coast and create small villages, which would eventually lead to larger cities. However, these settlements would be a very long way from home, and so it is unlikely that any ethnic Chinese would live here permanently. Instead, the colonies would consist mainly of sailors, soldiers, and administrators who would rule over the local populations. This is where the Ohlone and other native peoples would come in. And so the Chinese would found their colony in the area around the modern Oakland, San Jose axis. The native population of the region, the Ohlone peoples, would become subject to the might of the Chinese Empire, although they would likely be treated better than many other indigenous groups. The Chinese had no tradition of slavery and generally left conquered peoples alone, so long as they paid tribute. Additionally, the abundance of resources and wealth in the Americas would mean that the Chinese rulers wouldn't need to extract labor from the natives, meaning that many of them might even be left alone to do pretty much whatever they wanted. In fact, this new Chinese California could potentially ally itself with the natives against the other Chinese colonies. If given the chance to learn Chinese ways, some natives could become bureaucrats and administrators, working for the Chinese government. In terms of exploration, the Chinese would quickly establish themselves as major players on the Pacific coast, rivaling the Portuguese for control of the lucrative trade routes. Speaking of farther north, this raises an interesting question: how would the Chinese colonization affect later European powers? However, there's another option. Perhaps the Spanish would simply ignore the Chinese and focus on exploring and conquering other parts of the Americas. If the Spanish had won this war, then it is likely that the Chinese would have abandoned their colonies in California and would not have returned to the Americas for several centuries. This period of coexistence would also likely lead to a clash of cultures, resulting in new languages, religions, and customs. During this time, the Chinese would introduce the printing press and the compass to the Americas, allowing for the rapid spread of knowledge and exploration. If the Chinese were to industrialize earlier, then it's likely that they would begin exploring and colonizing other parts of the Americas. On the flip side, the Chinese colonization of California would create a cultural divide in the American West, which would last for centuries. So what would California look like today if the Chinese had colonized it in the 1400s? On the other hand, the rest of the Americas would be much more like our own timeline. Overall, the world would be a very different place if the Chinese had colonized California in the 1400s. Thank you for watching. What do you think would happen if the Chinese colonized California? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.